Okay, and so part two of the lecture, or the other part of the lecture for week 6, we are looking at gender and the family. So we've done sort of biology and sexuality, and particularly that critique of essentialism. And now we look at the structure of gender, particularly, and so we do the sociological imagination, the history, structure, culture, gender as much as we can in a short lecture, and then we talk about domestic violence and issues around gender and violence, which will be the part of the focus of your second assignment. So we start looking at gender.
So people act towards reality on the basis of the meanings they give to it, and these meanings are modified in social action, and can be individual acts of prejudice. But there's that broader social level. Gender exists in the law, in family, in work, in education, in medicine, in religion, literature, media. All of those have a gendered aspect. We can look at the gendered patterns that exist in all of those areas. In what way does the law operate in relation to women? What roles are different in the family? How does it impact on work? How does it impact on education? In what way does medicine think about women that's different from men? How does religion impact on women? Why are there predominantly male priests and so on? In literature, we can look at how women have been excluded from the literary canon, and the way women are portrayed in literature and the media are important aspects of sociological analysis. And that all relates in sociology to the structure of male dominance that unfairly privileges men relative to women. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about patriarchy. So we do our sociological imagination, as we always do on these things. We look at the history, the structure, the culture. The first part here, we'll look at the history and the structure. So let's think about how we became aware of these issues. And the predominant pattern here, the predominant thing I'm going to focus on this time, is not a history of the role of women in capitalist society, but the ways that institutionalised sexism has been challenged by the feminist movement. And don't confuse femininity and feminism. Femininity and masculinity are the key gender constructs in our culture, and we'll talk about those in the second half. Feminism is a movement to end institutionalised sexism. And as I talked in the earlier lecture, biology is used to justify these relationships as natural, as if sex and gender are simple parallels. But in sociology, we want to break that nexus and talk about many of you in the assessment to define gender as sex, as being of the male sex or the female sex. That's not what gender is. Gender is the social roles and norms around having a male body or having a female body. So in simple terms, the roles, the male roles and the female roles. But in this lecture, we're going to think about it more in a cultural way. So feminism was that movement. More recently, there's been a backlash against feminism, and people say it's gone too far. The thing there to think about is, well, what were the key demands of the feminist movement? Does anyone remember those? They are essentially the right to control one's own body. Predominantly, that meant the right to choose whether to have a child or not, the right to have an abortion. In the case of Indigenous women, they were more focused on the right to keep their children and not have the state take them. Issues of rape and sexual violence, domestic violence, the right to live safely in one's body, free from violence. Free 24-hour childcare, so women could work and pursue lives independently of their children. And equal pay for work of equal value. So the question when somebody says to you, oh, this feminism thing's gone too far, well, you can ask yourself, well, which of these demands have we got too much of? Now, certainly there have been gains. We have women's health centres, we have rape crisis centres, we have refuges, we have more childcare, we have abortion clinics, we have those services, but you have to pay for them. So that's only going to affect, if you're poor and living in a rural area, it's much harder to affect those rights. You have to go in Mackay, you have to go to Townsville for those services, and that's not easy, especially if you're a young woman and not earning a good income. The right to control one's own body, well, we're becoming more aware of those issues, but there's still a strong backlash against women's right to choose. The final one then is equal pay for work of equal value. So we'll talk a little bit about that one. The first equal pay case was in 1969. Up till then, women were legally entitled to less than 25% less of men. So there was a male wage, male basic wage, and the female basic wage was 25% of that. 25% less than that, 75% of it. So as a group in the late 60s, 1969, 1970, women earned 59 cents for every dollar that men earned. In average, if you took average weekly earnings and looked at men and women as a group, you would find that women were earning 59 cents and men were earning $1 in that group. By 1973, these legal changes in the basic arbitration system had improved that to 70 cents in the dollar and 77 cents by 1975. And in 79, the figure was 80. So things were improving with that change in the legislation and changes in the way the courts dealt with equal pay. And eventually that was the equal pay case in law, and then later on there was equal pay legislation. By 2013, it was 83.5%. So 40 years after equal pay legislation, women are still reigning about 85% of men. And that has big impacts over the long term. If women, stop work to have children, that puts them a long way behind in terms of their career paths. It puts them a long way behind in terms of their superannuation and those kind of issues. So, shorter pay makes a lot of difference. That's why women are predominantly, when you look at the poor in any society, but including in ours, the poor are predominantly female. So, poverty is a female gendered thing. This sort of fact is periodically rediscovered by the media, so you get this hoo-ha every so often that suddenly someone discovers that women are paid less than men as a group. So we see that in the media, and it's not hard, just type it into Google. But there's still a very strong gender division of labour. So if we look at these structures, what do we find? You can have a bit of a study of this graphic. But what do we find? We still find these strong patterns. Of course, it's not. We're looking at patterns. Remember, so we're not saying no women. There are no women engineers and no women doctors and no women lawyers, which 100 years ago was much truer. But we can still see there are strong gendered patterns. If you look at this graph, we can see that women make up less professionals than men who predominate in that, and within those professions it would vary. So those equal pay scales would vary quite strongly according to industry sector. But here we're just talking about the representation within different sectors. So predominantly that would be teachers. Women are concentrated in professions as teachers, but you can see how the shape of the pie is quite different. So there's a lot more. Women are doing a lot more intermediate clerical work than men. So there's more secretarial work, and the other professional group would be nurses. So women are concentrated in that sort of nursing, teaching, secretarial work structure. Now, of course, there's a lot more women doing a lot more things than in the past, but there's still a strong gender division. Across the board globally, this isn't just a pattern in Australia. Women do more housework. You can go back and look at my previous lecture from the first half. Women do about 3 times the housework that men do, and that's independent of the amount of paid work that women do. So men's paid work stays roughly the same. Men's unpaid work in the home stays roughly the same. Women's doesn't change very much until they start to do 30 hours part-time, at which point they're just simply running out of hours, at which point the rate of housework starts to drop. But women still work a double shift, and we can see these sort of patterns here, about, in this case, about equal pay are across the board. Women earn less than men, women do more housework than men. Violence against women is endemic. This has been a controversial issue, and it's hard to know how much to report or how many assumptions still exist out there amongst people doing courses like sociology, I'd recommend that you have a look at the basic social surveys. Again, I'm not predominantly interested in individual acts and attitudes. Certainly there are sexist attitudes. There are a lot of myths about violence against women. A lot of rape myths. We see them in the media recently with a couple of the cases in the United States. She deserved it. It had something to do with what she was wearing. Women lead men on. Women are responsible. Those kind of myths. That violence is a product of it's just a private matter, but that is still a fairly strong one, and that it's more likely to happen with strangers. That's another set of the myths. Just trying to think if there are any others. Women at most at risk from violence from people they know, from men they're in relationships or former partners. If they're young, and if you just look at the murder rate, you'll find a high percentage of those are women. It's certainly the most dangerous time when a relationship breaks up. If we're looking at just that tiny number of people who get murdered at all, it's going to be women murdered by their partners, and it's a much higher rate than you'd expect. I'll go and check the numbers after I finish this lecture. But when we look at those broad patterns, we see that in, say, the 96 Women's Safety Survey, 5% of women experienced physical violence in the last 12 months. 1.5% of them had been sexually assaulted. 2% of women who were in a relationship had experienced violence by their current partner in the last 12 months. Now, you're talking about 100,000 people, 2%, right? 23%, if we generalised it to the population. 23% of women who had ever been in a relationship had experienced violence, so that's like 1 in 4, 1 in 5. 1.5 million women experienced violence by a previous partner, and 9% of women reported some sort of abuse within the relationship, so broadening it out from just physical violence, which tends to be the narrow definition, although legally it's now recognised that there are other kinds of domestic abuse, manipulation, isolation, intimidation. It may not initially begin with physical violence, or physical violence may not be the predominant component of domestic abuse, but other forms of abuse, controlling someone's money, controlling someone's behaviour, are also forms of domestic violence. I'd recommend then that you go and look up some statistics. I've written on aspects of violence. The other myth that we could address is that men are equally likely to be victims of violence and so on. These in the home. These figures just don't bear up to scrutiny, I'm afraid. Men are much more likely to be victims of violence, almost 4 times more likely to be victims of violence overall in the private and the public sphere. Overwhelmingly, that will be violence in pubs from men they don't know, as opposed to women's experience of violence, which will be from someone they know in an intimate partner setting. So women's experience and men's experience of violence is very different, and it's not equivalent. Men are far more likely to be victims of violence overall, but women are much more likely to be victims of violence. 80% of violence that happens in the home, at least, is male and female violence. So we need to be clear about those sorts of patterns. In the second part, we're going to start looking at the culture. So we've looked a bit at the structure. I'd encourage you, if you do this topic, simply to go and look at the statistics. The gendered nature of violence is a very, very clear pattern, and I suspect that nobody really doubts it outside of arguments about equivalence in domestic violence. I think we all know that men are socialised to accept violence as part of being a man, that men are expected to fight wars, men are expected to fight in pubs, and women are socialised to be nurturing, not to say it's innate, just that they're much less likely to be physically competent at violence than men are, because we don't train them that way. Which doesn't mean that all men are violent, doesn't mean that no women are, but those broad patterns around masculinity and femininity would have to be wrong if it turned out that violence was equivalent. So before we go into the next part of the lecture, ask yourself, what does it mean to be a real man in a culture? Because that will give you the clue for masculinity. What is our culture saying it is to be a real man, and how does that fit with the institutionalised structure we've just outlined? Part B, we're looking at the sociological imagination culture around gender and sexuality. So what ideas, norms and values do we have around gender? I recommend you go back and have a look at that Gender Identity Project, because that picks up a lot of the themes that sociologists use. Sex and gender are different things. They're on a continuum. Many of you still talking about sex and gender. Sex is the biological part, gender is the role, the social part, and they're on a continuum. And don't forget that men have a gender. So that's what we're going to focus on instead of women. So masculinity and femininity is a huge topic. There are many ways to be a man or a woman, or to be a sexual human being, and it isn't about the biology or the body, it's about the meanings that attach to those bodies and how we live them out. So there's variety and there's patterns. So let's start with the main pattern. And if you want to get a sense of what the main pattern looks like, there's no better place than wrestling.
Right, for those of you watching the YouTube version of this lecture, you will have to find your own wrestling video, because the YouTube people won't allow me to use 2 minutes of a wrestling video that was on YouTube until a few weeks ago. So go and have a look at something about The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin or something like that was the bit I used. Doesn't really matter for the purposes of illustration, though. It's certainly intriguing, though, the way this YouTube version works. If you want to see the actual clip I used, it'll be on the Moodle site, on the Echo system. So.
Now, of course, wrestling is a performance. In fact, it's almost a parody of hegemonic masculinity, but then so is masculinity itself a kind of performance, and femininity a kind of performance. So yes, people tell me wrestling's not real. I understand that, but then neither is the performance of masculinity in a sense. And these guys take it to the extreme. But you can see those sort of patterns, the lone male individual warrior who uses violence. There's stuff there about class too. Wrestling is sort of much more interesting than it might first appear, but the way they play on those themes, even the names of the characters, they're good and bad characters, but it's Stone Cold, it's The Rock. So these are tough men in single combat. They sort of represent the real man ethos that's associated with masculinity. Now we call that, in sociology, we call that hegemonic masculinity. Now hegemonic, let's break it down. Hegemony, which means being in the lead, was used by the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci to talk about class relations and how did the dominant class maintain its position without using force. So hegemony means ensuring the consent of the governed, being legitimate, allowing to rule by providing moral and political leadership over the mass of people. And this consent is secured by the construction of an ideological common sense that's organised through social institutions and processes of everyday life. And the well-known Australian sociologist Raymond Connell applied this idea to male gender and called it hegemonic masculinity. Probably the leading theorist of gender in the world, Raymond Connell. And if you want to start to get into that, you think, well, what does it mean to be a real man in our culture? And the images that conjures up, like the wrestling, are part of that cultural form. It's a cultural form of hegemonic, not genetic masculinity, and it's the leading one. It's not on its own, it's not uncontested, there is competition, but that's the one that people think of when they think of being a real man. Now it's important to try to get out of your psychological way of thinking about these things. Think of it as cultural. It's not a type of man. It's not type A masculinity or anything like that. It's a cultural form in which men participate, more or less, They act it out. It's maintained around a set of practices that govern men's behaviour, and they might conform to it and try to be real men. They might reject it and say, I don't want to be like that, or it's somewhere in between, resisting it, accommodating to it, and so on. The opposite, being a real woman, well, in a patriarchal culture, no femininity is dominant. There's not a dominant form of femininity. So Connell called that emphasised femininity. It selects out aspects of women and their bodies and emphasises them as being important. The thin body ideal being the obvious one. That the idea that women need to be beautiful, that what is sexually attractive in women is a particular kind of body type, blonde, large breasts, tall, whatever set of constellations comes to mind around that set of the thin body ideal. And we can ask ourselves, what does this symbolise about women? What does it mean that we think, or what we think of as attractive in women? And what does that mean in a patriarchal culture? I'll leave you to talk about that. But both of these, the idea of a real men and real women, they're both myths. And myths, I don't mean something like a fairy tale or a fable, a meaningful narrative, a set of stories that the culture tells ourselves that makes sense of what's going on out there. The idea that there really is real manhood and real womanhood is a fallacy like race, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have enormous social consequences for both genders. Gender is everywhere. It's what we do. And the challenge is to understand that gender is what we do, but it appears as if it's something that we are. Holter does some interesting work on that in his PhD. Masculinity is an invention based on the idea that our behaviour stems from being a particular kind of person. And this is a very modern notion. It emerged in the middle of the 19th century, that people were particular types. They could be categorised and catalogued and studied. Masculinity is a relationship. We tend to see males and females as opposites, but that's a relatively new idea. In the 18th century, men and women were certainly seen as different, and women were seen as inferior because the culture was still patriarchal. They were incomplete versions of men, but they weren't opposite to them. So a great deal of work, it was assumed that they were like mirror images, so that if men had to have orgasms in order to produce children, then women must have had orgasms too, because they were simply mirror images, except men's organs were on the outside, men's sexual organs were on the outside, whereas women's were inside. So ovaries were seen as analogue of testicles and so on, so it was seen as mirror images to each other, not opposites to each other. Now, for us, gender is not a biological thing. It's a structure of social practice. It's those social practices that are ordered around reproduction. The body, human reproduction, arousal, sexuality is about intercourse, arousal, childcare, childbirth, and how we organise those things in society. That sort of social order. It refers to what bodies do, and biology is there, but it doesn't determine what happens. In fact, as Connell points out, gender exists precisely to the extent that biology doesn't predetermine the social. My cat has just had a litter of kittens. Nobody taught her how to do that. Nobody taught her how to seek out the right place, to find a safe spot. Now the kittens are starting to walk. She's looking for another spot where they won't all wander off. That's all wired into her. She doesn't have a gender, even though male and female cats act differently. They don't have gender in the sense of needing a social system to tell them how to behave. Because human beings aren't connected to their biology in that way. These things intersect with race and class to create a whole new varieties of black and white, working and middle class masculinities and femininities. So they're all mixed in together. You can see that too in the wrestling. There's that take a job and shove it, a very sort of working class masculinity telling the boss. Often the Rock is portrayed as the corporate hero. So there's a whole lot of ambiguities around his kind of masculinity and the way Vince McMahon is kind of a character in his own massive production. Notice that these men enact or perform hegemonic masculinity. They're not necessarily hegemonic men. The men who conform most to the stereotype of hegemonic masculinity are not the ones who are actually running society. Bill Gates, former Prime Minister John Howard, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd are not participants in a hegemonic kind of masculinity, even though they are leading the country. And if there's hegemonic kinds of masculinity, then there are also subordinate kinds. There's nerds and wimps and sissies and gay men who are subordinated kind of masculinities behind this real man style of masculinity, more or less marginalised. Lots of different ways to be a man. Sexualities work the same way. We can touch on it a lot in this course. We have to see the same sort of patterns. You have lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender identities, how people identify themselves at that level. We have attitudes to that, pro or anti, but homophobia being the problem, leading to gay bashing and other kinds of violence, or just the marginalisation of people who aren't allowed to participate fully in society. Think of the legal structures around marriage are being contested now, so that's a way of discriminating. And that's because heterosexuality isn't just a personal choice. It isn't about who you want to sleep with or how you want to express your desire or which kinds of bodies you're attracted to. It's wired in deeply into the structure of society around family types, around the law, around who can inherit, and that those cultural norms. So it's important to see sexuality as more than just a sexual practice and more than just attitudes. It's wired in. As we saw with gender, they're not opposites. They're on a continuum. In that video from New York about the range of possibilities, but subordinated masculinities tend to be seen as more feminine. We can ask ourselves about why that is. Why do we think of gay men, or men who want to have sex with men, as feminine? In what sense are they feminine, and why do we call them that? What are the implications of that? Why is two men not doubly masculine? How come it becomes feminine? What does it mean that when men engage in activities that particular kinds of sexual activity, we read that as feminine? I'll leave that one for the discussion board as well. Homosexuality is a kind of masculinity, a subordinated form of masculinity. This was not even thought, it was not thought that way even in the early studies of masculinity to go back 20 years. Homosexuality was studied as a separate issue, whereas now it's much more seen as a kind of masculinity. So just remember, hegemonic masculinity is not a type. And Connell puts it this way, it's the configuration of gender practice which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of legitimating patriarchy. That's in that culture, right? It guarantees, or is taken to guarantee, the dominant position of men and the subordination of women. Remember that division of labour in the private and public, the women getting paid less, doing more housework. We justify that with the notion of hegemonic masculinity. It's the way we make sense of it. It's the narrative. There's a payoff, a patriarchal dividend. It's not huge, but it's enough. We don't need psychological theories or biological theories to explain what is happening. Men have an interest in the way things are presently laid out. Maybe not in the global sense of things, but at an individual level, men feel they're invested in it. Hegemonic masculinity constructs them as having honour and prestige and the right to command others, women and children in particular, and other men. And in this context, I would say violence in some form is inevitable. The dominant gender holds and uses the means of violence. Men use violence to maintain their dominance, and they exercise it as a right. Not all men, but many, in various forms. It might be physical, verbal, sexual, harassment at work, wolf whistling. Men compete with each other, so that is going to lead to violence between them. Major violence is transacted between men, with men as perpetrators and as victims. And it's a way of trying to recover a lost sense of legitimacy. You only resort to violence in that sort of hegemonic masculinity, is about ensuring the consent of the governed, but violence occurs when that legitimacy breaks down and force is required to try to maintain your role, your sense of power and prestige, in the same way that in the broader society police actions aren't used to stop protests most of the time. It's only when the situation's getting out of hand. Sport, you can see this played out in sport. I don't know whether you want to regard wrestling as a sport, but other sports have that same arena. Real men play with each other. They're hard and tough and aggressive. Women are separate. Women spectate and cheerlead. Of course women play sport too, but the dominant cultural forms of sport are male dominated, and the role of women in those is to spectate. Men bond with each other as a group of equals, so mateship is a kind of competitive male friendship against women. In a lot of ways it's a fratriarchal, a kind of brotherhood rather than a hierarchy. We've seen regular allegations about sport and sexual assault, and sociologists want to draw attention to male bonding and sharing sexual experiences. A culture of sport. If you're going to have groups of men interacting together, women need to legitimate the heterosexuality of that. So we allow men physical contact on on the field, but we need some way to make it clear that there's nothing homosexual about that, because that would be undermining patriarchal notions of what it is to be a real man. And so women play that role of legitimating. The culture of sport is about aggression and conquest, and the one need to prove one's mythical masculinity. And it's in that context then where we get sexist beliefs about rape. We don't ask questions about men, we ask questions about women, whether she asked for it, what she did to become a victim, and so on. It's part of that victim blaming culture. And of course this is why, women, we remember the accusation of being emotional about the evolution of rape, the social biological or evolutionary psychology ideas about rape that were in the earlier lecture. Another way of thinking about this is to use Kaufman's work on the triad of violence. That violence takes three forms. It's violence between men. Men are much more likely to be victims of violence in public, in this kind of competition over who the real man is. Men are sent to war by other men, by and large. Men enact violence against themselves. They're much more likely to die in car accidents, to commit suicide, to be injured at work, to have undiscovered medical conditions because they're trying to tough it out, and so on. And then there's violence against women. We looked at the domestic violence stats earlier. The culture of hegemonic masculinity leads to outcomes that see women and children more likely to be assaulted. Again, massive amounts of evidence. A number of years ago, we could think of in Rockhampton, there was 600 apprehended violence orders. There are 400 women in refuges in a town the size of Rocky, and that pattern be repeated across the country. In 2000, the local refuge in Rocky did a survey of Year 10 boys and found that, of course, if you ask them, is it okay to rape a woman, they're going to say no. But if you ask them, is it okay for men to have sex with women against their will or without consent, if they can get away with it, almost a third of them said it was okay. And what needs to be challenged in all that, of course, is the behaviour of men. It's said that men can't control themselves, or that violence is minimised, although now we recognise non-physical abuse. At the time, most of the time, it's I just pushed her, I just bounced her against the wall, and so on. It's not because I didn't close my fist and punch her, then it doesn't really count. I don't really think about why men are happy to have this sort of image of themselves as sexual creatures who can't control themselves, that as a woman in a short skirt, or they were drunk or whatever, they're no longer responsible for their own actions. I mean, it's not a very flattering picture of men, but so very few men seem to be able to make a stand against that. Hegemonic masculinity, well, men benefit, but they don't all benefit equally. There's class and race dynamics, obviously. Footballers aren't running the world, wrestlers aren't running the world. The sorts of men who are running the world are not generally hegemonically masculine stereotype. There's a widespread feeling there's a crisis in masculinity, which we might be able to relate to class. And as part of this, of course, there's been a backlash against feminist ideas. Some men, with legitimate grievances about how the system operates, allow their anger to be diverted against women and see women as the fault. So we get these myths that men are just as likely to be victims of domestic violence, that men are routinely denied access to their children, and so on. None of which serves most men's interests at all, but blaming women doesn't help the situation. In your assignment, I hope you can draw all this into your assignment. This is the sociological imagination around domestic violence. So just pulling together what we've done in the course so far, not just in this lecture. We know that capitalism gave rise to the private sphere in the 19th century. Prior to that, men and women had worked together on the farm. There was separate spheres. Work was carried out at home. But with the rise of the factory system, you got this division between men and women associated with the home and men associated with work. A breadwinner and a homemaker sort of model, the traditional nuclear family. A lot of this, of course, was challenged in the 70s. It was turned into a public issue. And we know that domestic violence is correlated with belief in traditional gender roles, social isolation, and consumption of alcohol. So there's your sort of historical connection to capitalism. We know that in terms of structures, we've talked about the structure of violence and so on, that class, race and gender are, the class varies with income, the violence varies with income, that violence is gendered. And we know that race is higher, and we can connect that not to the fact you've got black skin, but to the fact that different ethnic groups are more likely to believe in traditional gender roles. they're more likely to be socially isolated from the dominant culture, and often in case of Indigenous people, alcohol is a factor as well. So we can ask ourselves about the ideas, norms and values around violence. We even talk about domestic and family rather than male violence. We tend to take violence as natural for men, the real men and them, but maybe not their victims. Violence is natural for them. And so we also live in that victim blaming culture where we ask, what does she do? Why didn't she leave? And we pathologise that as well. We say, there's battered wife syndrome, and we look to the victim. In the critique, a lot of work's already been done in trying to change the culture around sport and leading sports people to speak out against violence, that real men don't use violence, and that's very important activities, and getting men involved in anti-violence work, both on account of themselves as victims, but also their wives, daughters and sisters. And there's a day every year in November, White Ribbon Day, where men make some pledge to make a stand against violence.
Every week, at least one Australian woman dies from domestic violence.
It happens all the time, doesn't it? I just give her a backhand, usually shuts her up.
But there is something you can do about it. Because thousands of good men have got your back.
Hey, mate.
Swear an oath this White Ribbon Day to put a stop to violence against women. Visit whiteribbon.org.au.
There's a number of well-known anti-violence activists. Robert Jensen, I've just given him a talk. Jackson Katz, Mike Dormitz and the Date Safe Project, and Michael Kaufman's Triad of Violence I've already mentioned, so there's some links there to those things. So I come to these questions as a Marxist feminist. I think the links to class are more important than as generally. I regard myself as a pro-feminist, and I regard that as necessary intellectually for understanding how the world works, and at a personal level. What pro-feminist men are asking in relation to anti-violence is that, is basically the idea that men care more about the women in their lives than they do about being seen as real men, and are prepared to challenge those stereotypes. Thank you.